Okay, so today we're going to be talking about factoring trinomials, but this time, instead of having them have a 1, where the a is like down here, instead of them always being a 1, it's going to be a different number. So first, let's practice factoring the following. Check for a GCF first. Always check for a GCF. Okay, so see how these are all have 1s in front of them? So a is always 1. And then B is 14, C is 45. So in the new lesson, we're going to have an A that's different than 1. And if it's different than 1, we have to do something a little different. So remember, when we factor, we make an X. We put A times C on the top and B on the bottom. A times C, well, 1 times 45 is 45, and B is 14. So what multiplies to 45? So what are the factors of 45 that add up to 14? Well, we know that 9 times 5 is 45, and 9 plus 5 is 14, so that's our answer. And remember, we can just jump into x, whatever the variable is, so x plus 9, x plus 5, and it doesn't matter which order. That's your answer. So same thing here. If there's a 1 in front of the n for number 2, so A is 1, B is -3, and C is -28. We draw the x. A times C goes on the top, B goes on the bottom. A times C is 1 times -28, which is -28, and B is -3. So we know 7 times 4 is 28, but we need to make a -28 and a -3. So we're going to make that 7, because 7 minus 4 would be +3. So we have to make that 7 a negative. And again, we just jump into n minus 7, n plus 4. Okay, so notice here we can take out a GCF. All of those numbers can be divided by 2. 2, 2, and -24. So the GCF here is 2. So we're going to take out a 2 before we start anything else. So if we divide this first term by 2, we're left with just a squared, because 2 divided by 2 is 1, and we don't need to put the 1. You can if you want. 2 divided by 2 here is again 1, so we're just left with a. And -24 divided by 2 is -12. Now we have A is 1, B is 1, and C is -12. We're going to draw the x again. So we have -12 down here. It has to add up to 1, right? 3 times 4 is 12, but we need to make it a -12 and a +1, so we're going to make that 3 a negative. And then it's a minus 3, a plus 4. Don't forget about your GCF. So this is where I think a lot of people forget. Don't forget to bring that down in your final answer, because you took out a 2 at the beginning. You have to add that back in. Okay, so out of all of these numbers, a 4 goes into it, every single one of these numbers. So we're going to take out a GCF of 4. So if we divide the first term by 4, we're left with p squared. -24 divided by 4 is -6. You're going to keep that p, and then 20 divided by 4 is 5. So now we have a 1 in front of that p squared. A is 1, B is -6, C is 5. We draw the x. A times C, well, we have 1 times 5, which is 5, and our B term is -6. 5 times 1 is 5, but we have to make both of them negative, because negative times a negative is a positive, and -5 minus 1 is -6. Now we're left with p minus 5, p minus 1. And don't forget, we have to put that GCF at the very beginning, so that's your final answer. So all of those, even though we had to take out a GCF in the last 2, all of those had a 1 in front of the squared term. The a squared had a 1 in front of it, the p squared had a 1 in front of it. So we can just draw the x and jump straight into here. Okay, we're going to cross off these directions because I'm going to teach you a little differently. I've actually never taught it like this, so I'm going to just show you with examples, okay? So let's look at the first example. Oops, I didn't mean to do that, sorry. Okay, so notice how it has a 2 in front of it. So notice that the a term, remember how we normally label this A, B, and C? The a term is not 1, and there's no GCF. So usually what we're used to is if there's a 2 here, we could take out a 2 out of all these terms. But we can't take out a 2 out of 5 or 3. So in this case, we have to factor this a different way. Now we're going to start off the same. We're still going to label A, B, and C. So A is 2, B is 5, and C is 3. We're still going to draw the x, and we're still going to do A times C on the top and B on the bottom. So A times c this time is 2 times 3, which is 6. And our b is 5. We're going to do the same thing. We have to find the factors of 6 that add up to 5. So we know 2 times 3 is 6, and 2 plus 3 is 5. Okay, now this is where it gets a little different. So rewrite your original equation. I just rewrote this equation down here. We're going to drop the first term and the last term down. So notice all I did so far is I dropped the first term down, I dropped the last term down. This 5x, we're going to split up into what we found here. So do you agree that 2x plus 3x, 2x plus 3x is 5x, right? How did I get the 2 and the 3? From here. Now the reason I added x's to it is because it has to, we're not changing anything, it still has to add up to this middle term. So 2x and 3x, we're going to split that up into 2 pieces. Okay, now we're going to take the first half, so these first 2 terms, we're going to wrap parentheses around it, and we're going to wrap parentheses around the last 2 terms. We're going to take the GCF of the first 2. So just these 2, what do they have in common? Well, we can divide a 2 out of each of them, and they also have an x in common, don't they? So we can take out a 2x. Okay, what are we left with if we divide by a 2x? Well, 2 divided by 2 is 1. And x squared divided by x, we had 2 x's, we took away 1, we just have 1 left. And what's 2x divided by 2x? Well, anything divided by itself, that's just going to be plus 1. 2 divided by 2 is 1. We had an x, we took away an x, we don't have any x left, so we just have 1. Okay. Okay, now what can we take out of these 2? We can take out a 3, a positive 3. What are we left with if we divide the first term by 3? Well, we're left with just 1x. 3 divided by 3 is 1, and then x. And then 3 divided by 3 is 1, so it's just plus 1. Now the key here, this is kind of how you check your work without actually having to check your work. Do the middle 2 pieces match? They do, and if they don't, you did something wrong. Okay, so 1x plus 1, that's one of our terms in our answer. The last part is 2x plus 3. Whatever's left over is your last piece of that puzzle. That's your final answer. Okay. Okay, let's try another one. So look at example 2. Notice that the 5, we can't take out a GCF anywhere. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to say, okay, A is 5, B is negative 17, and C is 6. We're still going to draw that x. A times C goes on the top, and B goes on the bottom. A times C is 5 times 6, which is 30. And B is negative 17. Again, what multiplies to 30 and adds to negative 17? 2 and 15. If you're not sure, all you have to do is start dividing this 30 by numbers. So divide by 2, divide by 3, divide by 4, until you find something. So we know that when we divide it by 2, 2 times 15 is 30, but if we make both of them negative, they make a negative 17. Okay, so again, remember this is different. Usually if this was a 1, we could just say x, or m in this case, m minus 2, m minus 15, and be done. But in this case, we need to rewrite our equation. We're going to drop the first term down, just like over here. We drop the first term down, then we drop to the last term down. That middle term is going to be split up into whatever we found here. So it's negative 2m and negative 15m. Now we're going to wrap parentheses around the first 2 and the last 2. By the way, it doesn't matter which way you put these. If you put negative 15m first and negative 2m second, you're still going to get the same answer. You can try that if you want to. You'll get the same answer. Okay, now what's your GCF of the first half? So remember our GCF over here was 2x. The GCF over here is m. They don't have any numbers in common that we can take out, but the GCF is m. So I'm going to take out an m. What's left over if I take out an m? Well, I didn't even there's no numbers I'm dividing out, so 5 stays the same. I had m squared, I took out an m, I only have 1m left, so I have m. And then negative 2m divided by m is just negative 2. What's my GCF of this last piece? Well, it might look like they don't have anything in common, but they actually have a 3 in common. So we're going to take out a 3, and what are we left over with? Well, negative 15 divided by 3 is negative 5m. Okay, and then 6 divided by 3 is 2. Now, do the middle two match? These don't match, right? They have opposite signs, 5m minus 2 and negative 5m plus 2. So if this happens, notice they're the same numbers though, it's just the signs are flipped. If this happens, take out a negative 3 instead. Then all the signs will change. So if we took out a negative 3 instead of a positive 3 here, watch what happens. This is going to be a positive 5m instead of a negative, and this is going to be a negative 2. Now let's just check, because remember when we take out a GCF, it should match what we started with originally. So what's negative 3 times 5m? Negative 15m. What's negative 3 times negative 2? Positive 6. And now do these guys match? They do. So now we can take out one of those pieces, and remember whatever's left over is the other parenthesis. Okay, and remember we can always FOIL to make sure that it matches the original equation. So if you wanted to check your work on a quiz, you could actually be 100% sure you got all of them right if you just FOIL these out, if you ever wanted to do that. Okay, example 3. So we're going to take out, notice the 6 is, there's no GCF, okay, and so we're going to say A is 6, B is negative 5, C is negative 4. We're going to draw our X. A times C goes on the top, B goes on the bottom. Our A times C is 6 times negative 4, which is negative 24, and our B is negative 5. So what multiplies to negative 24 and adds up to negative 5? Well, 4 and 6, 4 times 6 is 24, but we can't get a 5 out of that. What about 8 and 3? That works out. 8 times 3 is 24. And then which one do we make negative to make a negative 5? We have to make the bigger number a negative if this guy down here is negative. Okay, now rewrite your equation. Bring the first term down and the last term down. We're going to split up the middle number into whatever we found here. So negative 5y splits up into negative 8y and a positive 3y. We're going to wrap parentheses around the first two and the last two, and then we're going to look for the GCF. So what's the GCF of these first two? Well, we can divide a 2 out of both of these, and we can also take out a y. This has 2 y's and this just has 1 y, so we can take out a y. So if we divide a 2y, what are we left with? 6 divided by 2 is 3. Y squared divided by y is y. Negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4. And y divided by y, if we just take out a y, then we don't have any y's left, so it's just 3y minus 4. And then what about the GCF in the second equation? We can't take out 3 doesn't go into 4, no numbers go into these, and one has a y and one doesn't have a y. If you have something like this, your GCF is just 1. So there's nothing else besides 1 that goes into both of those. So we're going to put the GCF down here, so plus 1, and what are we left over with when we divide? Well, 3y divided by 1 is 3y, and negative 4 divided by 1 is negative 4. So you're going to have the same equation here, because if you take out a 1, nothing changes. Do these two match? They do, so that's part of our answer. And then our leftover 2y plus 1, 2y plus 1 is our leftover part of the equation, and that's your final answer. Okay, so let's try example 4. A is 12, B is 11, C is negative 5. Okay, A times C on the top is 12 times negative 5. 12 times negative 5 is negative 60, and our B is 11. So if we find the factors here, again, put it in your calculator. Do this divided by 2, divided by 3, divided by 4, until you find something that works. Which one do we need to make negative to make a positive 11? We need to make a negative 4. Okay, bring your equation down. The first term and the last term drop, and then the middle term splits up into whatever you found here. So negative 4c and 15c. Wrap parentheses around the first two and the last two. We're going to take the GCF of the first half. So 12 and negative 4, well, a 4 can go into both of those. And what about c squared and c? A c can go into both of those. So we're taking out a 4c, and what are we left with? 12 divided by 4 is 3. C squared divided by c is c. And then if I have this and I divide out that exact same thing, I'm just left with a 1. 4c divided by 4c is just 1. What's the GCF on the second half? Well, we have 5, right? And they don't have a c in common, so we can't take out a c. So we're just left with a 5. If we divide 15 divided by 5, we're left with a 3, and then the c just drops down. Negative 5 divided by 5 is a negative 1. Do the middle terms match? They do, so that's one piece of it. And then we take our leftover pieces. That's your final answer. Okay. So number 1 here, again, we label A, B, and C. Draw the X. A times C on the top, B on the bottom. So 3 times 10 is 30, and then B is negative 11. So 5 times 6 is 30. If we make both of them negative, then that gives you a negative 11, and a negative 5 times negative 6 is a positive 30. Okay, now we're going to rewrite this equation, drop it down. We're going to bring the first term down and the last term down. Hopefully you guys are seeing a pattern. We're going to break the middle term up into whatever we found here, which was a negative 5x and negative 6x, because it still has to make a negative 11x in the middle. We're going to wrap parentheses around the first two and the last two and find the GCF. So the GCF of the first two, notice 3 and 5, we can't take out a number, but x squared and x, we can take out an x. They both have an x in common. If we divide out an x, what's 3? Well, first of all, our 3 is going to drop down because we didn't take out any numbers, right? But what's x squared divided by x? So we had 2, we took away 1, we have 1 left. And then we had negative 5, we're just going to bring that number down. And then if we had x and we take away an x, we're just left with no x's. What's the GCF of the second half? Well, 2 can go into both of these, right? So we're going to take out a 2. So if we say negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3x, 10 divided by 2 is a 5. Notice these two don't match again. What's different? Well, we have a 3x and a 5 for both of them, but the signs are switched. Remember, if the signs are switched, instead of taking out a GCF of a positive 2, we actually have to take a GCF of a negative 2 out. So all you have to do is say, oh, okay, instead of a positive 2, the GCF is actually a negative 2, and flip the signs inside. Now do those match? They do, so that's our first part of our answer. And then whatever's left over is our second part. And remember, you can also always distribute at the very end to make sure you get this equation at the beginning. I want you guys to try 2 through 4. We're just going to do a couple more. So I want you guys to try 2 through 4. We're not going to do 5 and 6. And then all you guys are going to have to do, I think we do 10 or 7 and 8, and then I do 9 with you. So we're almost finished. So it says look for a GCF first and then factor the remaining trinomial. So they have a GCF of 5. Every single one of these numbers you can take out of 5. So do that first. If we divide out of 5, we have 2 left. 10 divided by 5 is 2. 75 divided by 5 is 15. And 35 divided by 5 is 7. So all we did was just divide a 5 to all of these numbers, and this is what we're left with. Now we're going to label A, B, and C. Draw your X. A times C goes on the top, B goes on the bottom. A times C is 2 times 7, and B is 15. So 2 times 7 is 14, B is 15. Well, 1 times 14 is 14, and if we do 1 plus 14, that's 15, so that's our answer here. Now, ignore this at first. You want to put this in your final answer, but we're just going to rewrite this equation down there. Remember, you drop your first term, you drop your last term, your 15 gets split up into 1k and 14k. Remember to add the k's so they both add up to 15k at the end. Okay, wrap parentheses around the first half and the last half. What's the GCF here? Well, we can't take out any numbers from 2 and 1, but we can take out a k from k squared and k. So if we divide the first term by k, we're left with 2k plus 1. What's our GCF of the second half? They don't have a k in common, but they have a 7. So we can divide out a 7, and we're left with 2k plus 1. Do the middle terms match? They do, so that's your first part of your answer. And then k plus 7, you're going to drop that down. Don't forget your 5 needs to come down at the very end because that was your GCF you took out at the beginning. You have to remember to add that into your final answer. Okay, I want you guys to try 8. We're going to do number 9 together, and then we're not going to do 10. So your GCF here, your GCF is 3. All of these numbers can be divided by 3. This is when your multiplication tables come in handy. So 5y squared minus 6y minus 8. What did I do? I just divided every single one of these numbers by 3. Okay, our a is 5, our b is -6, our c is -8. We're going to draw an x, and we're going to have a times c at the top, b at the bottom. A times c is 5 times -8, which is -40, and our b is -6. What multiplies to -40 and adds to 6? 4 times 10. We're going to make the 10 negative so that it makes a -6 when we subtract. Then we're going to bring this down. Remember, we're not going to worry about the GCF until the very end. We're going to add that in our final answer, but we're going to rewrite that equation. Our first term and our last term drop down, and then this middle term splits up into 4y and -10y. We're going to wrap the first two and the last two in parentheses. What's the GCF of the first half? Well, we can't take out a number, 5 and 4, we can't take out anything, but we can take a y out of y squared and y. So our GCF is y. What are we left with when we divide this by y? Well, we can just drop down the 5 because we didn't divide out any numbers. And then y squared divided by y is just y. And then we can just drop down the 4, and then y divided by y here is just nothing. We don't have any y's left. Now our GCF. Now here's a hint here. If you have 2 negatives, we can actually take out a GCF of a -2. Only because they're both negatives, and you see how this is all positive down here? If you took out a 2, that's okay, but you're just going to have to go back and change it to a -2. So if you notice they're both negative, you're going to be taking out a -2 for the GCF. So we're left with, so -10 divided by -2 is a +5. And -8 divided by -2 is a +4. Do those match? They do, so that's part of your answer. The leftover pieces is the other half, and then don't forget to bring down your GCF at the very end. That's your final answer.